Well, it's been brought forward and touted as a gold standard trade deal. Eventually, there will be no tariffs on New Zealand exports to the UK.
The EU trade deal is supposedly next, but they're playing hardball, and trade with economic powerhouse India is declining. I
caught up with Trade Minister Damien O'Connor in Parliament and began by asking him, is the new UK trade deal really a gold standard in equity for Maori?
Absolutely. I mean, we have a specific chapter in there that focuses on opportunities and consideration of the Maori economy. It's a growing economy. This is world first in that particular place. In terms of gold standard, it's only Australia that is the other trade partner that ultimately has zero tariffs, and that's where we will be after 15 years.
Oh yeah, in terms of Maori though, how enforceable are those chapters, or is it just window dressing to make it look inclusive?
Look, the UK understands the importance of this from a constitutional perspective, and it was a new challenge for them to consider such things in a trade arrangement, but we dealt with that really early on, and then they've worked through to an agreement that I'm sure will be followed through by Maori in particular, and the UK understand the importance to us.
But it doesn't sound like these are enforceable chapters.
They will be, I'm sure, and that, as with most trade agreements, these will evolve over time and we'll make some adjustments. I think the world of Indigenous trade, Indigenous people's rights, is an ever more important part of every country, certainly the developed countries that have taken these things for granted, now realise that they have to consider, what has happened in the past.
Why couldn't you get a gold-plated deal or a gold standard deal with the EU as you have with the UK?
It's a slightly different conglomeration of economies and more complex, of course, but it's a market of 450 million people, so a lot larger. The economic potential far greater in the EU than the UK. And, of course, in the UK we had strong traditional connections. The EU, slightly different, more complex, as I say, but we've made huge progress.
Have you made huge progress? The farmers seem to be bitterly disappointed with the allocation that they've received or are going to receive in terms of quotas of meat to EU.
We'll be the single biggest supplier of dairy products into the EU. That's a significant step forward. They haven't opened the door to anyone else. We're at the forefront of that, and I'm sure over time that will improve as well.
But it's still not very much, and in terms of the amount of meat being exported to the EU, it's very small, isn't it?
Initially it is, but I have to say, we struggle to meet all the market opportunities that we have now. So we're limited by the volumes. It's one more option for exporters, and that's what we're attempting to achieve with our trade recovery strategy and export diversification.
Did you jump too soon with the EU? Could you have waited longer to get something better?
No. In fact, the risk was that if we didn't conclude, then we wouldn't have anything. And
but your job is to open doors. You told us last year that your job is to open doors for business. Are you confident you've opened the doors in the EU?
Absolutely. We went through this. We agonised over this. It was right down to the last minutes, literally, when the Prime Minister and the President von der Leyen, Prime Minister Ardern and President von der Leyen were announcing this. There were still technical details that we were working through. We held out to the last minute, but clearly the areas of food production, dairy and beef are very, very sensitive. The fact that we made progress was something that trade negotiators thought impossible 10 years ago.
Do you think we're getting enough return on investment diplomatic-wise? We support the EU diplomatically, for example, like in the Ukraine. Surely there's a quid pro quo for that in terms of trade.
I think we're getting it.
So you're happy with what we're getting?
We're a market of 5 million people. Theirs is a market of 450 million. The economic opportunities into our country are somewhat limited, but they saw the value in connecting with a country that shares their values and aspirations in climate change, labour standards, biodiversity, animal welfare. All of these things are the components that the EU want to see in future trade agreements. We've started and we've set a really good standard with them. That's what they've appreciated.
So the standard that you've set with the EU in terms of dairy and meat, right? It's a lesser deal. It's not very big. If we're happy with that, why can't we take that model and go to India and say we don't want to deal with dairy?
Well, no, we can't have a trade agreement without our core exports. But the proportion...
But Australia has. Australia's done it without, say, dairy, haven't they?
Yeah, they have done it, but on the basis that it's a very small part of their total economy and export profile. It's the single biggest one for us. For us to have a trade agreement and have no reference to dairy would be irresponsible. Nonetheless, I believe we can over time build cooperation across the dairy industry, and we had one of the big players out here in New Zealand. We can we can get that progress to a point where there's value for them in having a trade agreement with us that includes dairy, and there will be restrictions, I'm sure.
Are you stuck on dairy and agriculture? Shouldn't we just be going for, say, a high export market like technology and just forget dairy, put it aside? That way we can get a deal done quicker. And time is of the essence with India. It is growing rapidly.
It's and the proportion of benefits from technology. Does it have to be and?
They're never going to move on dairy, are they?
I think they will. I think there's a view that, of course, the growing expectations for dairy protein in India cannot be met by internal production. And that's where we, as partners, can sit alongside them. The big co-op like Amul, based on New Zealand's model, I think will be willing to work with us as a trusted partner to supply and fill the gaps.
We mentioned Australia before, and they've done a limited deal, but they did get sheep meat across the line. And that's not something that we're being able to do. So deals can be done.
It's a challenge. Of course we have to sit down. Every trade negotiation is difficult.
They've also got reduced tariffs on wine and horticulture. So you can buy Australian avocados over there, you can buy Australian lamb chops over there, but not New Zealand.
And that's what we'll try and achieve over time, and some of them might go into the market now, meet all the phytosanitary standards and pay the tariff and still be in market. So, but a trade agreement focuses on reduction of tariffs and non-tariff barriers, and ensuring there's a level playing field when we go into that market. So that's our ambition over time. We're building stronger economic relationships. We've had 3 ministers in 6 months into India. We've had an Indian minister here. We've got strong and growing economic relationships. We don't have a free trade agreement on the table at the moment.
That's right. So, look, Australia has got a deal, and we were on that path with John Key. He went over there and visited Prime Minister Modi, invited Prime Minister Modi back. But we haven't had a Prime Minister go over to India since Labor's been in there.
John Key ran into a brick wall, and they said no further progress on the free trade agreement. So he ran into the reality that is still the case. But what we have done since then is we've worked collaboratively in terms of apple production, in terms of dairy and technology. We'll continue to grow those relationships so that India sees us as a trusted partner, not just as a supplier of goods.
Do we have the time, though? Isn't it urgent that we diversify away from China? We've been talking about it for years, and align ourselves with another emerging super economy and superpower?
Well, we've got to be realistic about the volume of goods that we can produce from our country, and in some areas of primary production we are limited by our land area and by technology. We'll grow that over time. We can't supply all the markets with everything that they want.
Have you invited Prime Minister Modi to New Zealand?
Look, I'll leave that to the Prime Minister to answer on that.
Right.
The door is always open every time I travel. I extend to my colleagues at a ministerial level the opportunity to come. And indeed, we saw an Indian minister in our country in the last few months.
Jacinda Ardern helped seal the deals with the EU and the UK, but she hasn't been to India with you. Is the Prime Minister, Chris Hipkins, going to go to India?
I won't speak for the Prime Minister other than to say that
it would be helpful, though, wouldn't it? It would be very helpful.
It's always helpful to have the Prime Minister travel and advocate for trade, but we don't always have to visit. And indeed, I'm confident he'll be meeting with the Indian Prime Minister and passing on those messages very clearly.
Is there a chance that we could be marginalised if we don't get a deal soon?
No. Not at all. I think that we'll continue to be a significant economic partner, not in terms of scale, but I think importance and technology. We share similar values with India. We have a large Indian population within our own country, so the links are building all the time, and I think we'll be able to build off them to ensure that we have better trade arrangements, better cultural arrangements, better people-to-people arrangements that ultimately will lead to a free trade agreement.
Which includes dairy?
Absolutely.
Finally, let's talk live animal exports by sea. The last shipment has left, but it's taken 2 years to get to this point. Why didn't you end it sooner?
Look, we've felt that the industry that had geared itself up, it had infrastructure in place. There were a number of different components of the live export trade, including assurance from MPI. We felt that there was a 2-year timeline to phase out was fair and reasonable, but the clear signal was this was going to end.
But in that time, live animal exports have actually increased and animals have suffered, and National Party has said they're going to revive it. Have you opened that opportunity for that trade to continue if you lose power?
No. I mean, I think that it'll be up to the party, whoever comes in, if they want to reverse that, then they can address the issues in the international marketplace, both the UK and the EU, where they said that we won't determine what our animal welfare standards are, but let's not reduce them in any way for a trade advantage. They can address those issues, you know, at the time if they choose to change the policy. A Brazilian court has ruled that live export should cease from that country. That may be appealed and overruled, but that's an indication of what is happening around the world.
Did it take 2 years so you didn't really sort of annoy China, which was the biggest market, that it would end abruptly? You're keeping them on side?
It wasn't about market. This was about actually the travel of the animals. And we're in right down the bottom of the southern hemisphere here. Many of those markets are in the northern hemisphere. They go across the equator. All the reports I had, and I'd spoken to many people, said that heat stress was something that couldn't be mitigated. These are animals that get less than 2 square metres for 3 weeks on a ship going through the tropics. You know, any reasonable New Zealand farmer actually, and half of them said they don't support the trade. So, look, on balance, to protect our reputation in the international marketplace in places like the UK, EU, and everywhere else around the world where people are concerned about animal welfare, we thought it important to protect our reputation.
There are also calls to end the live animal exports by air. Is that something that you would do?
No, I mean, they're not in the air for 3 weeks, you know, and so high-value animals, it's a very high-cost air transport. They're in the air for a very short space of time, and we
so
think
that
that's
trade
reasonable.
will continue?
I think, yes. This is about the animal welfare and the welfare of animals for 3 weeks on boats in cramped conditions through the tropics, not the same as being in an air-conditioned air freighter.
Okay, Trade and Agriculture Minister Damien O'Connor, thanks for your time.
Kia ora.